The Civil War is America's bloodiest. But the Reconstruction years after the war ends is also a period of intense violence. It is the newly freed slaves who suffer the most.
Historians don't know how many African Americans were killed in the wake of the Civil War, but it was an extremely violent period. Hundreds, probably thousands, had been killed between 1865 and 1866, all over the South, in virtually every city, in virtually every state, in virtually every county.
In Pine Bluff, Arkansas, a mob of ex-Confederates burns a black settlement to the ground, then hangs 24 of the black men, women, and children. In North Carolina, a wealthy white woman is charged with killing a black mother who had tried to protect her child from a whipping. A reporter in Nashville writes, "White men are writing about whipping, maiming, and killing all Negroes who do not obey the orders of their former masters, just as if slavery existed."
There were instances in which African American women who were pregnant were lynched, and they had the babies pulled right out of the womb. There were instances in which African American men were castrated. And oftentimes, these events were almost like the carnival, where hundreds of whites would come out to witness them.
The violence suffered by blacks during this time is often perpetrated by Southern landowners attempting to keep their cheap labor in the fields, like Amos Black, who demonstrated his brutality in the summer of 1865 in Tennessee.
You've been fooled by the damn Yankee lies that you thought you was free and you could not obey your master. There ain't no law against killing niggers. I'll kill every damn one I have if you do not obey me and work just as hard as you did before the war.
This is not the post-Civil War America envisioned by Abraham Lincoln. On April 11, 1865, 2 days after Lee surrenders to Grant at Appomattox, Lincoln calls for a reconstruction of the country, a rebuilding of trust and a dedication to peace. Just 3 days later, Confederate sympathizer John Wilkes Booth commits what many believe to be the first act of terror by the Southern insurgency.
Lincoln's assassination had such a terrific impact on the nation because in the minds of many Northerners, they felt that Booth was part of a greater conspiracy with the Confederate government, Jefferson Davis at the lead. And so not only have these people caused this Civil War, this bloodbath for the last 4 years, but now in their death throes, they would actually turn to assassination and kill this magnificent man. So guess who's to blame? It's the South. It's not John Wilkes Booth, it's the South.
While much of the nation weeps, many in the South refuse to mourn Lincoln's death.
In one instance, there was a lady who was told to either display mourning, which she hadn't up to this point, or face the consequences. She refused. She says, "What?
Show a sign of mourning for Abraham Lincoln. Who but for him would not be husbandless or childless today?"
So the soldiers ran through the house themselves until they found her widow's weeds, the dress and veil she had worn to bury her husband and son. And the boy brought those back to Mrs. Stewart and said, "This is what you'll display."
And she says, "All right, you folks step across the street. I'll display this myself with my own hand." The soldiers went across the street. They saw the lady come out onto her porch. They saw her hanging the widow's weeds around a piece of wood across the porch. And then they saw her also tie it around her neck. And before anyone could react, she stepped off the porch and she hung herself. This was her final act of defiance. But scenes like this went on throughout the South in the aftershock of Lincoln's death.
Suicide seems extreme, but many Southerners are bitter after 4 long years of war. The Civil War claims the lives of nearly 260,000 Southern men.
Historians think that probably 1 out of 4 white Southern males of military age was either dead or very seriously wounded by 1865. And by very seriously wounded, I mean having a life-threatening injury like a traumatic amputation, where they were probably never going to be physically made whole again.
Those who are able return home to utter devastation.
The soldiers that returned from the battlefields found their cities almost totally destroyed, many of them beyond recognition. They found trains demolished. They found crops burned. They found the animals dead by the side of the road, the stench. People talk about the stench on the way home, how terrible it was.
Thousands starved to death. Orphans wander the streets. Homelessness runs rampant.
The nation that had barely come into being has now been destroyed. It had a demoralizing effect on a lot of Confederate veterans. They were exhausted by the war, and they had been defeated by this war. And in a society or in a Southern culture that valued the idea of honor, this is about as shameful an experience as they could be going through, to have been defeated by the Yankee.
But for Southerners, what may be the most difficult part of the defeat is the social and economic cost of the loss of slavery.
The social order had been, of course, turned on its head. No longer were there slaves. They were free black people now, with rights and with federal bayonets to back up those rights. It was a different world.
When the slaves are emancipated at one single fell blow, that causes half of the capital wealth of the southern states to disappear. It would be as though in 9/11 that not only did terrorists fly jets into a couple of buildings on Wall Street, but imagine if Wall Street itself was obliterated and how that would affect the economy everywhere. All of a sudden, no bank in the South had any money.
The slave trade had been a $2 billion industry, over $30 billion in today's currency. To maintain their wealth, many large plantation owners refused to free their slaves and launched their reign of terror. But violence associated with retaining free labor is only part of this second Civil War.
The other category of violence was anyone who was associated with political organizing for the Republican Party. And this could be either black politicians or white politicians, because they represented, as Lincoln himself did, the idea of overturning the old order in Southern society.
These politicians are fiercely loyal Unionists, known as Radical Republicans, and include Arkansas Representative D.P. Upham.
The Radical Republicans were the leftists of their day in that they wanted change now. They didn't want to talk about it a year later or 10 years from now. They wanted it now.
But that change includes granting full rights to the freedmen, which the Southern slave culture despises. The radicals become instant targets.
So it wasn't only African Americans. Any white Republican in the South was a marked man after 1865.
Amidst the violence, the Radical Republicans create the Freedmen's Bureau, America's first major relief organization. The Freedmen's Bureau is responsible for the general welfare of newly freed slaves, including creating schools and helping blacks obtain their own land. At the end of the war, the North confiscates over 800,000 acres of land from the South. The Freedmen's Bureau's mission is to parcel out this land to newly freed slaves, helping them transition from slavery to freedom. But these programs are severely underfunded and understaffed. During Reconstruction, The Freedmen's Bureau stations only 900 agents throughout the South. This lack of support comes directly from a man who has declared war against the radical Republicans. Abraham Lincoln's successor, President Andrew Johnson.
In my opinion, President Johnson was nothing but a walking, talking disaster. At every crucial point, he seems to come up on the wrong side of history. There would be no real land distribution, certainly not widespread throughout the South, and the blacks would not, for the majority, they would never control their own land.
For the 1864 election, Abraham Lincoln had asked then Tennessee Senator Andrew Johnson to be his running mate. Although Johnson is a Southern Democrat, he is an anti-slavery Unionist and would likely appeal to more conservative Democrats living in northern states. But while Johnson is anti-slavery, he is not in favor of granting rights to freed blacks.
Like most Americans of the 19th century, Andrew Johnson is a white supremacist. He despises the institution of slavery because of the power it grants the planter class in the South. After the war, with slavery now destroyed, Johnson proves rather indifferent to the plight of the freedmen, the blacks in the South. It's one thing to destroy the institution of slavery, it's quite another to then elevate the blacks to a level of social equality. Johnson has no intention or no desire to see racial equality brought to the South or anywhere.